Hello, Alex here. It's been a while again since the last video. I've had a few busy weeks, which meant I had a lot less time than I would have liked, but I've managed to finish designing Lunara, also known as the Timeless Town. This is the main hub that the player will be based in, and provides most of the services that the player will need throughout the game, as well as some sightseeing opportunities. Although I didn't have as much time as I had planned, surprisingly, it didn't take as long as I was expecting it to. I had a good idea of what buildings I wanted to have, and the themes I wanted to present through the town. The three main ideas I had in mind were to have a town that had a fantasy feel, was full of natural beauty, and which mixed traditional and modern architecture. I think these goals tied in together well, which made the design process easier, as well as resulting in some more interesting ideas. Let's take Gelato & Co as an example. I touched on it in my last video, but for anyone that hasn't seen it, it's a general store that the player can buy their supplies from. It started as a simple ice cream shop, eventually becoming a popular tourist destination, and as their business grew, it expanded into a supermarket, with the goal of becoming a national chain. If you've seen my previous video, you might also notice that the building looks a little different. I thought that the previous version of the building didn't have enough detail to it, but I wasn't sure what else I could add to it, so I accepted that it was satisfactory and moved on. But as I finished my next building, I noticed that it looked quite plain in comparison, and made some changes so it looked a bit better. This takes us to one of the main challenges I faced during this phase of development, which was trying to keep the quality of my work consistent. It's a matter of opinion, but I like my work to be at a consistent level, whether that's consistently good or consistently bad. One of the next buildings I worked on was the blacksmiths, which I hope you can infer from the design. It being a regular feature in games meant that there were a lot of good references available, making it easier to get an idea of what a good building looked like. I think using brick and wood panels for the facade allows you to add a lot of character to a building, as it's an easy way to add a lot of detail in. In contrast, I struggled a lot with buildings that were plainer in design. Let's look at Blundermuffin, a small hobby store where the player can play various mini-games, although that depends on how many I'm able to get made. My idea for the building was a mix between a cottage and a comic book store. I'm not sure if the green colour is the best representation of that, but that's the colour I had in my head when I thought of a comic book store. I wanted to have a plain wall, but the trouble I had was trying to make the building look interesting without being able to add much detail to the building itself, and also how I could show that this was a modern hobby store without making it contrast too much with the traditional design. I think the key for adding character here was to focus on what's on and around the building, rather than the building itself. I added some vines to the roof and dotted some plants around, which is always good for adding a cozy fantasy touch. I made the door into a glass one, and added a view of the interior, which I think gives an idea of the kind of place it is. I could do the same for the window, but I think it messes with the appearance of the scale of the inside. The programming side was pretty light this time around, which I actually started to miss a bit. I do enjoy the graphical side, but a good chunk of what I was doing was copy and pasting fences, which gets tedious after a few minutes. The main thing I did was to add scene transitions, so you can travel from one area to another. It doesn't sound like a lot of work, and the process is quite simple, as it's a matter of loading one scene and deleting the other. But there's some extra things to consider, such as making sure that both scenes don't exist at the same time, which could potentially cause problems. I added a fading animation to smooth out the transition as well, so it wouldn't be jarring when you moved between areas. When there's a lot to load, this isn't so important, as you'd be waiting for a bit anyways, but in the case of instant loads, you want to delay it a bit. I also made a mapping system between spawn points, so it would be easier to connect entrance points together. When designing these components, it's always good to consider what you might need to do in the future, and make sure it's supported. You'll thank your past self for it. I could talk about my thoughts and processes for quite a while, but I've got some other things I want to go over, so let's speed things up and do a quick tour of the town. This is the only building where I'm not too sure what it's intended for. I originally wanted to have a restaurant here, then decided I wanted a tavern instead. As I was designing it, I noticed that it looked a bit like an old Chinese building, so I decided to roll with it, and I think I ended up with a bit of a mix of styles. I liked the idea of having a small Japanese street bar on the side, so I added that as well. You might notice that there's a giant cup of green tea behind the building, which I added because I was toying with the idea of the building being a bathhouse. You might ask what that has to do with a giant cup of green tea, and now that I think about it, I'm not too sure myself. I think, in the end, I might have the building be a combination of everything. I was originally planning to expand the map out a bit, so that there was an empty space when you reached the border. But I don't think expanding the map would actually solve anything, and after playing some other games, I realised that the easy solution was to limit the camera movement at the border of the map. I applied it to the cafe as well, to limit the amount of dead space on the screen. I'm quite proud of this one. I based this building off of Greenwich Observatory, and outside of looking at a few photos, there were minimal references used here, but I think it turned out pretty well. It's positioned at the highest point in the town, so you should be able to get a good view of the night sky, which I hope will look quite nice. You might notice that there aren't any flowers up here, unlike the bottom of the town, which is because I think it's not necessary and distracts from the background. I wanted Lunara to be a hilltop town, where one of the main attractions was the view overlooking the rest of the kingdom. I'm really happy with how it turned out, even though it's mostly trees. I wanted to have a few important landmarks in sight, which may or may not be explorable areas. Since the background is meant to be in the distance, the objects are quite small in scale, which means that it doesn't require a lot of detail, which made designing this a lot quicker than I planned. Next, we have the Mayor's Manor. Not too much to say here, but I like the colour palette and overall design. The blacksmith isn't too special in design, but I had the idea that the forge was fueled by the magma from a nearby volcano, which sounded pretty cool. Finally, we have the health clinic, which is built into a tree. I originally wanted it to be a cherry blossom tree, but I had some trouble figuring out the design and getting it to not stand out too much, as the colour palette would contrast quite a bit, so I went with the standard green colour. The line art is a bit wonky in places, but the colour composition does a lot of heavy lifting here, so I think it turned out alright. That should be it for the tour. There's probably things that can be added and improved, but it's at a point that I'm happy with, and I can now move on to the next bit of work. My goal is to have a demo ready for the Steam Next Fest in February, which gives me about 3 months to get everything I want done. I'm not sure how much there will be on the demo, as it depends on how much I can get done. But there's also a lot of things I want to keep secret until release. The current plan is to have the core cafe gameplay ready, as well as being able to explore Lunara and meet some of the characters. There's some areas connected to the town that I might be able to add, but it's not the focus for now. I also want to have a dungeon that can be explored as part of the adventuring gameplay, which is what I plan to work on next. As well as designing the dungeon and the enemies, I also need to revamp the combat system a bit, and develop the player's progression system. My current vision is to use a skill tree system to advance the player's abilities in various aspects. I like being able to choose what I can upgrade, rather than it being unlocked automatically, so I think this is the best choice. I also need to make the player's skills swappable, and make additional weapons and spells. I'll try to have a boss battle ready for the demo as well, but I imagine that will be a lot more work than everything else, so I can't promise that it will be ready in time. Once the combat side is done, I'll work on developing the cafe gameplay further, so the player is able to customise and develop Dreadwinter, such as being able to move and add furniture, as well as using different machines. I'm not planning on the demo being particularly long, but I think it would be good for the player to be able to try out some of the upgrades you can get. That should cover everything I wanted to talk about. My goal is for the dungeon and combat system to be done by the end of November, so I'll aim to get another devlog out by then. Thanks for watching, and consider liking and subscribing, and also wishlist Dreadwinter on Steam, it really helps.